There, my name is Sarah Bell. I'm a third-year PhD student at Brown University in archaeology. And I'm really happy to be here with you today to share this presentation. I'm grateful to chat for opening up this space for us to talk to each other about things that matter and to connect with each other in a time when it's really difficult to do that. I am going to turn my video off during this presentation, so you don't have to look at my goofy face the whole time. And without further ado, I'm just going to launch right in. So my presentation is on attending to absence, Rocky Point Amusement Park, coronavirus, and the weight of what's gone. So what is this project about? Ostensibly, it's a contemporary archaeology project about absence and about fragmentation. But in reality, my intent with this presentation is really to query something more than just whether or not an awareness of absence can be considered one of the many bodily senses that we as human beings have access to. Really what this project was about for me was questioning the ethics of the habitual alienation that we as archaeologists practice, the distancing effect that what we do creates, not only between ourselves and between those we study, but also between us and each other. For those of us who really believe that archaeology is not just a scientific investigation of the past or of the contemporary moment, but is instead a discipline with what Buckley and Lucas would call transformative intent. There are times that a manufactured distance, both from what we are looking at and what we're experiencing as human beings ourselves, is really insufficient to the task. Instead, it's really our proximity to these experiences that should be defining what we do with them, how we look at these moments, how we write, and how we speak to each other about them. I think that if we really believe that what we do matters, then we should really be speaking and we should be writing and we should be presenting as though it does. And so I hope that you'll forgive me for speaking earnestly and speaking honestly with you for a moment as a human being to other human beings, as opposed to just a professional to other professionals. There can really be no doubt that what each of us has experienced over the past few months has been difficult in really intensely personal ways. Globally, we're all struggling right now. Often, when we think of an archaeology with transformative intent, what we're thinking about are issues of social justice and the way that archaeology can be mobilized to create more just futures. And that, of course, is deeply important and something that I'm very invested in myself. In this presentation, though, I really want to think instead about archaeology as a method of healing and a way of understanding the reality of how human bodies exist in the world and how we cope with the ramifications of the trauma inherent in that existence. And now that I've offered you those thoughts, I'm going to share with you a very silly video from the 80s. You will thank me for it later, trust me. I think I'm going to show you. There we go.
Come with your family. Come with your friends. That's the Rocky Point tradition, 'cause it's summertime again. Rocky Point is so exciting. Rocky Point, where you can come alive. Rocky Point, you're all invited to share our summertime. Rocky Point.
I'm really glad that my video was off. So why did I show you that video? I showed it to you because I wanted you to get a sense, a real sense of the vibrancy and the aliveness of the site that I'm about to tell you about. Rocky Point was an amusement park in Warwick, Rhode Island, but it wasn't just an amusement park in Warwick. It was really an institution. The whole shape of summer was structured around it every year for the residents of the town, and even the state and even the entire region. And that wasn't just the case in the 80s, it was really the case for over a century and a half. Rocky Point was in operation under various management, really starting in the mid-1840s. It began as just a lovely spot for a picnic, but soon the construction of a pier allowed steamboats to dock there, and we saw an influx of sightseeing passengers. And this led to other developments, including the addition of the shore dinner hall, a bathing pavilion, a hotel, an observation tower, and soon, of course, we had the carousels and the roller coasters and the midway, everything that defined Rocky Point as an institution before it closed. Eventually, Rocky Point became one of the most popular entertainment destinations in New England. I love this picture because look at all these people standing next to each other. It's amazing to me just how quickly our idea of what's okay publicly has changed. So in 1996, struggling with financial losses despite the universal love for this location, Rocky Point closed its gates for the last time. And today, when you speak to anyone in Warwick over the age of 30 about the closing of this park, the grief is still palpable. It's like they lost a loved one. There were repeated efforts to raise funds to reopen it. All of these failed. And eventually, after sitting abandoned for almost 20 years, the property was purchased by the state of Rhode Island, and the remains of the site were largely demolished. Interestingly, though, some fragmentary pieces of the park were left in place. And in 2014, with much fanfare, Rocky Point was reopened to the public as a somewhat bizarre passive use state park. So until this year, Rocky Point was a popular place to have a picnic, take a hike, all of this while communing with these bizarre ghosts of the amusement park that were left standing in the landscape. In spring of this year, however, like all the rest of the state parks, by mandate of the state, Rocky Point closed, and it was barricaded in response to the global coronavirus pandemic. It was during this time that I carried out the study that I'm about to talk to you about. What really drew me to Rocky Point as a subject of study was the difference between this and this, which is what I saw the first time that I visited the park. I had lived in Warwick for about 8 months before the day that I took this picture. During all of those months, I had no idea that this place existed. I discovered it really only after I had been stuck in my house for weeks under quarantine. My other local projects had been put on hold. Field work had been canceled for the summer. My husband's business had been forced to close temporarily. My daughter had been forced to leave college. She and I were both trying to deal with remote classes in the same tiny house, and I had just had it. I'd had it. So I got in the car and I started driving, and this is where I ended up. And I stood here and I looked out over this broken and fragmented landscape, and I recognized something about the sensations that I was feeling. And I realized that on some level, they were the same feelings that I'd been experiencing every time that I was confronted with an image like this, or every time I went to the store and I saw this. And it occurred to me that what I was feeling, not just emotionally, but through my physical senses, was absence. What was present in front of me was acting as an index or acting as a sign of everything that really should have been there and wasn't. So why was this happening? Why was I experiencing these sensations? I think that the answer really must lie in what Yanis Hamilakis calls the sensorial assemblage. Each of us, regardless of who or even what we are, exists within a web of relationships with people, of course, with people, but also with places, things, and also any number of immaterial variables, amongst which are, of course, things like memory, things like emotion, and the sensations that we feel in our body. And those are only a few examples. Society is really constructed of this strange combination of people and things. And the familiarity that we associate with this web of relationship really gives us a sense of balance in our lives. It's on the strength of this web that we build our understanding of what's normal and what every day feels like. Although, of course, it goes without saying that this is different for each of us, depending on things like geography, social circumstances, any number of other factors that distinguish one of our human experiences from any other. When variables, whether material or immaterial variables, enter or disappear from this network of relationships, it results in a feeling of imbalance. And the resulting imbalance creates a vacuum, which in turn results in feelings of discomfort and even trauma. I really feel that existing in the world in this historical moment is fraught with these kinds of uncomfortable sensations that result from things changing so violently, things missing that we're used to having there, and things present that we're not used to having in our web of relationships as well. I want to highlight here, just before we go on, that there's also a temporal aspect to this as well. And we see that both at the park and in our experiences in this historical moment. The space that lies between here and gone, sort of that space between absence and presence, is the same space that lies between then and now, between what was here yesterday and what's gone today. So that's something to think about too as we go forward. What I felt at Rocky Point that day really inspired me to ask the following questions. Is absence, and conversely, is presence, something that we as human beings experience through our senses? And then, is the sensation of absence that I personally experienced when visiting Rocky Point for the first time something that's felt by other visitors to the park? Because I felt like this was sort of a good and simple lens through which to ask this question, to look at this problem. The third question was, of course, is it possible to design a project that answers this question ethically during an airborne pandemic? For obvious reasons, ethnography is not really a viable option right now. In the case of this project in particular, it wasn't just the risk of transmission. The park was closed, and the people that were coming there, despite that fact, besides one crazy archaeologist, me, were not necessarily representative of what you might consider an average visitor. And as an example of that, the first person that I met at the park after it closed was a lovely gentleman dressed as a medieval crusader. And we had a fantastic conversation from a safe social distance, of course, and he showed me around, but I wouldn't call him average, an average example of who visits the park. So I began casting about in the absence of a way to speak to people about their experiences of the park. I began casting about for another way in which one might be able to read an awareness of absence into the landscape. Does the sensation of non-presence manifest itself in any concrete, any observable way? And a potential answer came to me when I began to consider other instances where it's already understood that absence is something that is recognized and experienced through the body. And an obvious and a very tragic example of this is, of course, the experience of phantom limb syndrome by somebody who is an amputee who's lost a limb. And for those of you who don't know, this is the experience of pain, of itching, or other sensations in a limb, in an appendage that's no longer there. So the absence of that limb makes easing that sensation very difficult. There's not a way to itch or to ease discomfort in something that's not there. So it occurred to me to ask the question, whether rightly or wrongly, if there might be some slight connection between this much more profound experience of absence felt through the body and what I was experiencing at the park. Beale defines phantom limb as a sensuous experience of something which is materially absent. And so perhaps there's a connection between what this amputee was experiencing in a much more profound way, of course, and what I experienced when confronted with, say, this monumental staircase that when you get to the top of it, this is what's there, nothing. It's just not what you expect, and it feels odd and out of place. This so links to so much of what we've experienced in the past few months, walking into a store and finding nothing on the shelves, or, you know, for those of us who work in an academic setting, walking through a university campus that's normally filled with people and finding nobody there. It's just a bizarre experience. It's super interesting to note that it's difficult to treat phantom limb syndrome. There's not a lot of ways to treat it effectively, but one of the most successful methods of treatment involves using a mirror, as you see in this image, to represent the missing limb, or in other words, to sort of re-presence that bodily absence. Being able to perceive that absence as being filled, as being whole, brings not just physical relief, but it's also a psychological relief, of course. And we don't have to look very far to find other examples of where these acts of material presencing are acting to ease a sensation of absence or of loss. And perhaps one of the most common, most ubiquitous examples of this is, of course, spontaneous memorials that spring up at sites of tragedy or grief or loss. To confront the sudden absence of a missing loved one, a friend, a neighbor, even somebody that we've never met, but that we have somehow connected with in their loss, we come to the place where that physical presence vanished, where it ceased to be in the world that we inhabit. But we don't just come and sit there and commune. We come and we bring things. We bring flowers, we bring teddy bears, we bring flags and messages, and we leave those things there. It's really interesting. We fill up that space of emptiness, and it's not because we think it's going to change anything. We know it's not going to change anything, but because in some way we know that this is easing that imbalance that's been left by loss. It's bringing a measure of comfort, not just to ourselves, but to others who are also experiencing that absence. It's filling up that absent space for those others who are mourning as well. Especially in the early days of the pandemic, I feel like this is something that we've witnessed firsthand, this tendency to fill spaces of both physical and emotional absence with material presence. So hoarding is a classic example of this behavior. Many of us have sought at one point or another over the past few months to control these absences in our sensorial assemblages through the obsessive collection of other things that we're afraid of losing. And this can be anything from staple goods, medications, cleaning supplies, and that's just a few examples. We each have our own thing that we were afraid to lose and that we stocked up on to the degree that it was possible to do so. Another example is overindulgence as an attempt at presencing in response to feelings of emptiness. Maybe we're drinking more alcohol than we used to, or if you're me, you're eating way more chocolate and yummy desserts than you need to. They're behaviors that are intended to soothe us and to restore that sense of balance and our sense of control. But even though some of those factors are immaterial, they're still manifesting themselves in material ways. And we see it maybe in overflowing recycling bottles filled with, recycling cans filled with beer bottles, or maybe we see it in our closet filled with 3,000 rolls of toilet paper that, let's be honest, in a lifetime, we are never going to use all of this toilet paper. In the light of examples like this, it occurred to me that it might be reasonable to investigate whether or not there were acts of material presencing happening at Rocky Point, and if these could potentially be considered as a reaction against the experience of absence in the same way that a spontaneous memorial or that something like we're looking on this ad on the screen might be. The question really of the project became, is material accumulating at the park in areas that could be associated with fragmentation and with absence? And the answer is yes, of course there's material accumulating here. It's a state park, people leave crap here all of the time. There is a huge assemblage of artifacts. You could never inventory them all. And it's not only because of sheer numbers, it's because the assemblage is constantly changing. It's constantly being added to, it's constantly being subtracted from. Even while the park was closed, this was the case. I've been several days in a row and taken pictures of the same exact spot and seen those assemblages just changing on a daily basis. I've even watched artifacts moving from place to place around the park. Why is this happening? I have no idea, but it's really fascinating, especially as they don't appear to move randomly. They seem to move from one space associated with absence to another similar space. There really wasn't a good way of tracking this in a short-term project. So rather than focusing on these portable kinds of artifacts, I decided to focus on acts of presencing that didn't move. Here's another insert of another piece of this plate, which was moving around the park. So at Rocky Point, the presences that don't move are graffiti and other forms of mark making. They're quite beautiful and quite lovely and very prolific. There's a lot of them. So let me just take a minute here to orient you within the landscape of the park. This is a park map that you would have gotten when you were visiting Rocky Point Amusement Park when it was open. And here is an aerial view of the park before it closed. Here we have the swimming pool, the flume ride. You can see the gondola ride sort of hiding in there. This is the dinner hall, the carousel, the haunted house, all of the parts of the park that used to mean a lot to people when it was open. This is the park when it was abandoned. And as you can see, a lot of these same structures are here. Many of the actual rides were sold off to other amusement parks, so those left fairly quickly. But a lot of these built structures remained for 20 years. This is Rocky Point as it is today. And so you can see there's quite a bit of change that's happened there. Much of what was once here has been removed, and some new features have been added. It's hard to see in this picture, but there are restrooms, there are some picnic benches and other things of that nature. Let's see, I'm trying to find my place in my notes here. Here we go. This figure gives you sort of an indication from an aerial view of what remains from the original park and what's been added as it was transitioned into a state park. So here in blue, we have, this is a picnic bench, this is a pavilion, restrooms, more picnic benches, here's another restroom over here. These are the kinds of elements that were added to the park in order to make it sort of feasible as a state park. These elements in green here are fragments from the original amusement park that were left in place. This is a water tower. Here we have the circle swing. This is where the haunted house used to be. There are still some steps associated with that. These are the gondola, what would you call them? The stands on which the gondola wires were run. And here are the entrance and exit stations of the gondola. These circles represent a series of caves that were part of a much earlier attraction at the park. They were closed off, I think, in the 80s, although there are some really interesting urban legends surrounding these caves. And here we have the railroad tracks that were associated with the little mini train that used to ride around the park. So that gives you an idea of what's still present in the landscape here and what's new from the state park. So I spent a really embarrassing amount of time locating and reading graffiti for this project. In the survey, I really took into account 4 data points. One was location, one was the date that it was made, if that date was given. Content was also considered, and then also repetition, whether the same mark was being repeated over and over again. The entire park was surveyed for traces of mark making, and that included standing structures, both those associated with the amusement park and those that were associated with the new state park, and also natural elements like boulders and trees, roads, paths, signage, that kind of stuff. Concentrations of graffiti were given a rank ranging between 1 and 6, with 1 representing only a single marking, 6 representing 50 to 100 markings, and you can see that chart kind of over here. So as we look at this representation of where the graffiti was located in the park and in what concentrations, it's clear to see that there is a really pronounced positive relationship between the location of the fragmentary remains of the amusement park and the concentrations of graffiti. The structural elements that are new to the park since 2014 were not targeted at all, with only one exception, and that is this little picnic bench right here, picnic table. And I included this mark sort of with hesitancy. It's definitely a mark, but it's a child's drawing in pencil. So it really doesn't fall into the same category as the other graffiti. Other than this, none of the new structures in the park were targeted at all by graffiti. There were 3 small concentrations of graffiti located in places not clearly attributable to either the amusement park or the state park. For example, this little guy right here is one single mark on a road that was part of the original amusement park, but is also part of the current park. It's a walking trail. So it's unclear as to what that's doing there. And then over here, we have a ghost, what's called a ghost in graffiti parlance. It's an old marking that probably dates to the period when the park was abandoned. And that raises a really interesting question, and that is this. Is it possible that the mark-making accumulations, which is previously noted are almost entirely associated with the old park, were they put in place during that 20-year period when the park was abandoned? And if this was the case, are these marks really a material response to the sensation of absence because the park wasn't gone at that time, there was still a lot there? Or would those accumulations speak more to isolation than to absence, the fact that there was nobody around that park when it was abandoned? So to eliminate this possibility, I took really careful note of all the dates that were left by the mark makers. Also, the relative isolation of each of the fragments was considered in relation to the number of marks that were made in each location. And in my mind, I thought, well, if none of the dated marks had extended beyond 2014 when the park was abandoned, then you might assume that all of these marks were made during the period of the park's disuse. And therefore, you could also assume that the interest in the park and in these fragments was really associated with an appealing lack of public observation rather than with an interest in the fragments themselves. If the dates extended beyond 2014, but only in areas of the park that were more isolated from public view, then it was still possible that isolation could have been the main factor here. As it turns out, the data reveals that neither of these scenarios was correct. There were clear evidence of older marks on the park fragments that were undoubtedly made during the years between 1996 and 2014 when the park was abandoned. But almost every concentration had at least one mark dated within the past 2 years. Most had at least one dated within the last month, well within the time frame of the pandemic, incidentally. So there were people coming in when the park was closed to make these marks. Several were made just days before the survey was done. And in one case, I actually interrupted somebody in the act of spray painting an art piece onto a wall in the water tower. Obviously, this is my favorite piece in the park because I saw it made. The question of isolation is really a more complicated one. Several of the most visible structures, including the exterior of this water tower, and both the upper and lower gondola stations are the most heavily marked, which appears to indicate that isolation really isn't a significant factor here. But of course, we have to take into account the possibility, even the probability, that a lot of this mark making is happening at night. Although this piece that we're looking at here, I interrupted him making it in the middle of the day, right in front of everybody. Of course, there was no one there. So that's possible, that it is about isolation and that these marks are happening largely at night. But that doesn't explain why none of the new elements of the park have been targeted at any time, day or night. That new complete assemblage of structures is just not interesting to these visitors at all. In terms of the content of the graffiti, the largest percentage were names, pseudonyms, or other marks that functioned as an identifier for a particular person. This matters, and not just because these marks are serving as an active sign of an absent body, just as the fragments of the park are working. It matters because they allow you to trace the movement of those absent bodies through the park. Where are they going? What spaces are they visiting? And finding significant enough to contribute this material presence. Just as I saw with the more portable artifacts that we talked about, these markers are moving from fragment to fragment in the park. So that concludes sort of the visual part of my presentation. And I want to ask, is this conclusive proof that what is motivating the accumulation of material at Rocky Point is a bodily sensitivity to absence? Well, no, clearly not. It's clearly not proof of that. But I think that it's fairly suggestive and that the premise could benefit from some deeper investigation. I also think that the idea gives us another avenue for looking at issues of social memory and placemaking, both in the contemporary world and also potentially in the ancient world as well. But for me personally, the real significance of this project didn't have a lot to do with any of that. It was absence that led me to this park, and it's absence that keeps me going back. Absence, yes, but also the indication of presences that were here just a few minutes ago. Each new mark that appears between one visit and the next one is an indicator that someone was there. There was a human presence there. And it's this establishment of another connection between me and this place and someone else who I'm never going to meet, but with whom I now share something that really feels profound. For me, these sort of spectral connections have helped to fill in the absences that in the last few months have brought into my life, as I'm sure they brought into everyone's, the sense of imbalance. And I think that that's okay. I'm going to let myself have that connection and that personal investment in the work that I do. And I think it's okay. And I do want to point out, in collating the absences of Rocky Point Park with these losses associated with the global pandemic, it's not at all my intention to trivialize or to make unimportant this sort of nearly ubiquitous trauma of the present moment. Rather, the opposite is true. My aim with this case study is to show that absence is something that is profoundly felt and experienced through the body and through the self, that it's unsettling, and that to feel great emotion or to feel unbalanced in the face of these absences is not only a normal response, but it's an inevitable one. And I also want to share this as a means of connecting with all of you, not just as fellow archaeologists, but as fellow human beings who are all being faced with questions of how this pandemic is going to affect our ability to keep doing what we love. In the case of Rocky Point Park, encounters with absence have led in many ways to the creation of new meanings and new places of significance. And I really hope that the same will be true of the field of archaeology, and that this pandemic is going to drive us to create new ways of seeing and new ways of connecting with each other and with our work. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much for listening, and happy fieldwork. Take care. Bye-bye.